Hi, I'm Michael, and welcome to Beyond the Screenplay. Today we're talking about Dark, the Netflix series created by Barenbo Odar and Jantje Fries. I'm joined by the Lesson from the Screenplay team, Trisha Rand.
Hello, everyone.
Brian Bittner.
Guten Tag, Mikkel.
And Alex Calleros.
Hello.
I'm really excited to talk about Dark, because I'm excited to talk about it with you guys, because we haven't ever all watched a TV show in its completion together, especially not a recent TV show, that this is all fresh in our memories. And as I was watching it, I was like, things were happening. I was like, oh, I want to know like how Alex reacted to that, or what Brian's thought about, or like, what's Trisha going to analyze about this thing? So I'm just very excited to talk about this with everybody. Quick spoiler warning. If you haven't seen Dark, we're going to spoil everything. And it's a show where you can't really talk about it without spoiling everything. So just that's what's going to happen. So prepare yourself. And yeah, so Dark is a really interesting show. It's a small town in Germany. It's a German show. And so it's very character based, but it's also a time travel story, but it's also kind of a murder mystery, but it's got a little bit of horror happening also. Like there's some Stranger Things vibes at one point. I found it really interesting. And I think it goes to lots of places that raises lots of interesting filmmaking and storytelling questions for me. So I'm excited to talk about all of that, and like time travel stories and the importance of choice and determinism and dramatic questions and how do you end shows. Like there's so much to talk about.
Just simple convo.
Right, just simple convo. But yeah, first I want to just sort of get your guys' initial reactions and thoughts to Dark. And so we're talking about this because Alex, you incessantly essentially told us to watch it. Finally, we acquiesced, and it was, once I got sucked in, it was like, okay, I think it's time. Like, let's all go watch it. Let's talk about it. So you were the one that saw it first, and we're excited about it first. What drew you into Dark?
So, I mean, I think a lot of the things that got me so jazzed about it are the same things that sucked you in, Michael, I would imagine, which is there's kind of a shared history between Michael and I of working on time travel stories together and trying to figure out, can you do a really self-consistent time travel story that doesn't really cheat or kind of rely on like magical rule changes, or where it's like, oh, you just changed it and now it's like all fine. When I realized what Dark was doing, especially like by the end of the first season, and even through a lot of season 2, where it was really committed to no, within this reality, whatever you go back and do in the past is part of the timeline that led to your present. And it's all kind of happening simultaneously, and everything you do is part of that pre-existing timeline. There is no real altering it because all of your quote unquote alterations are part of the past that made your present and your future possible. So the complexity of the show, the fact that it's juggling so many characters, this really big ensemble cast. We're following different kind of protagonists at different points in different episodes, kind of stick with different perspectives. We have other characters who are kind of like having their stories happen off screen and they're kind of dipping in, but they seem to have some kind of internal consistency to them, even as we see them at different ages. Like Claudia is a character like that, where she kind of dips in and you kind of have some faith that the creators have actually figured out what's going on with her off screen because they're so confident in the way that they're using her in her brief on-screen moments. So just watching all of that, my mind was just blown at the feat that they seem to be pulling off here, because I've attempted this in my own writing. On a small scale, Michael and I co-wrote a short time travel film called Stealing Time, like 10 years ago now. And that was an example of that kind of time travel methodology of like everything that happens within this kind of this time period created itself, a really self-consistent time travel loop. And Dark was, and then I worked on a feature film script that was like the feature kind of length attempt at that. And Dark is the TV series attempt at that, which is so mind-blowingly complicated. I just can't, I lost my mind trying to pull this off in 2 hours, and I trying to imagine doing this over 3 seasons. I can't even fathom the process. And so it was an interesting process for me watching it, because up until the end of season 2, it was kind of operating within the world that Michael and I had talked about a lot of, why don't we try to pull off a time travel story that really does stay within one reality and everything kind of creates itself. And then there's this kind of wrench thrown in it all at the end of season 2, which we can get into. And so that was really interesting for me because I was recommending it very strongly, kind of like as I was going. So I'm like, Michael, it's the thing that like we like about time travel. And then end of season 2 happened. And I'm like, Michael's not going to like this. And then it was really interesting to watch season 3 and see that they actually also did really kind of commit to this other kind of time travel as well. It wasn't just like a fluke. It was actually part of their bigger game plan. And I have lots of feelings about the way it played out. But yeah, I have so many thoughts as you do. I should probably just stop talking.
Yeah, and I want to talk about all the different kinds of time travel stories that there are in film, for sure. Yes, Trisha, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really interesting... This was the thing that fascinated me most about it when I sat down to watch the whole thing very, very quickly, because I didn't start watching it any earlier than season 3, like when season 3 came on earlier this year. So I was binging the first couple of seasons and then immediately starting to like binge the third season. So didn't have time to sort of let some of the characters and situations and stuff incept themselves into my brain. And I imagine that would be a very, very different experience, where if you had sat with the characters for several years and then like waited between seasons, perhaps rewatched and thought about it more and more, you would maybe have a different experience. For me, it was almost an interesting experiment in, like, I'm going to call it difficult TV. And by that, what I mean is a plot and characters that are complex enough and there are enough of them. And it's like you have 3 different actors playing one character, so you can't just go by like facial recognition. It almost like, you know, we imagine as we watch this that you have the creators of the show like in a bunker somewhere with like a murder board and everything like plotted out on it, you know, with all of their like yarn and everything, which I assume is true. Actually, I think I read that they had a computer program that was doing some of that stuff for them that they had like written for the show. But as a viewer, you're put in that same position where if you get invested in it, you are basically forced to do work to follow what's happening. This is not the only example of TV shows that are like quote unquote difficult in this same way. You know, we have lots of TV shows that have their own level or like barrier to entry. Like, I don't know, one of my favorite shows is Deadwood, but like the language of that is difficult for some people because it's like Shakespearean almost, but like incredibly profane as well. And it's like there's a ton of characters in that show as well. And there's a lot to follow. Thinking also about, shows like Lost, you know, your sort of classic mystery box shows where there's a ton of characters. There's a lot of plot happening. You have flash forwards, flashbacks, flash sidewayses. We see Lost. Anyway, so there is an appeal to a difficult show. But I would say that at least for the ones that I've seen, this is the one that sort of tests the appeal of difficulty to the greatest degree. So, you know, I found myself as I was watching it, like, pause. I like a character would say a sentence and I'd be like, hang on.
Right.
Everybody stop for a minute. What did you just say about what now and who? And then I would like have to stop and really think about it and do the like gymnastics of, okay, so if you did that thing and this thing and just desperately wishing for a chart and a family tree, and like there are many out there, and I strongly recommend you just get your hands on one. I resisted the urge to look at one that someone else had made. I was kind of like sort of doing my own mental family tree and chart as I was watching it, but then also like pausing desperately and like walking up to my screen when it shows like characters side by side. Like, okay, this person is this person, that person is this person, or like the family tree on the floor that we can get into in season 3 where I'm like, okay, here's how everyone is connected. Let's zoom in on it for a few minutes. So I think it's a really fascinating experiment for a variety of reasons, but that I think is one of the most interesting things about it. And I did ultimately end up enjoying it. The difficulty was off-putting to me at times, but at other times when like you figure it out, you're like, aha, I know what's going to happen to your grandkid. Boom. It is fun when you have those revelations.
Yeah. And that's, again, just another thing that I was thinking about is like, almost like the dramatic question of the show. Like, what is it? Like, why am I watching? It's another thing we'll talk about. But
There's a meta-dramatic question to the show between the audience and the show itself.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Definitely in my household, there were like rules during watching of like, okay, if you want to like discuss, like request a pause, and like we'll request a pause and like we'll discuss for a while like what is going on here. But like that was actually required for viewing it because people, like my parents were visiting or just me and my husband were watching it, and like people like had questions like, wait, who is that? What's happening? Like, why did they say that? And like somebody knew the answer, so we had to like pause and like have a discussion to then move on. Yeah. So I've never paused a show so much. So I share your experience, Trisha.
Thank you.
For sure. Brian, what was your experience?
Yeah, it was a show that I'd been wanting to watch since the first season. I heard a lot of good things and I had it on my to-do list and just never happened. So I was glad that you guys forced me to finally sit down and watch it. And I'm glad that I didn't watch it until I could watch it all at once. I think it would have been frustrating to have to wait between seasons, and not frustrating in a bad way necessarily, but frustrating in a frustrating way, in that way where you're like, ugh. But no, I had a really good time watching it. I think that my opinion of the show changed from season to season, not necessarily in drastic ways, but just, okay, now it's a different kind of thing than it was before. But ultimately, I just had a really fun time watching it. And as you guys were all saying, just how ambitious it is and how well executed so much of it is. And I just think it's great anytime you can watch something that just feels like, even if you like, regardless of what your personal opinion is about it, in terms of like how much do you like it or not like it or whatever, just to be able to watch something that feels like it is so expertly crafted, and so like they bit off so much and they chewed at least most of it.
Right.
And yeah, it's just fun to watch over the past few years, whether it's something like Endgame or something like Fury Road, where it's just like somebody is attempting something that has not been done to this scale before, and whenever people are able to pull it off, it's really impressive and fun to watch.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's kind of my big takeaway also, is that it's imperfect in areas, and at times I was loving it and at times I was frustrated by it, but overall, episode to episode, I was having a really good time.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I feel like they managed to at least navigate that for me, whereas, I think Lost we referenced already, and I think it's a very apt comparison, where it's doing this thing where it's like every episode is a question and you want to know more and you want to know more, but with Lost they never really tell you more, and then at some point they're like, actually the answers don't matter,
right.
It's all about the characters, right. And it's like, well, yes, but mostly no. And I feel like Dark managed to do enough of like answering. You felt like you were not just being taken advantage of.
Right.
Watching it is how I felt anyway.
Yeah, there were talking about the sort of like the fun of watching it. I think there were definitely times where I was sort of maybe frustrated by the top level stuff of like, oh, how this connects to this or whatever. But I felt like I never, in 22-ish hours of the show, I very rarely was not just having a really good time sitting there watching it.
Yeah, I do think it's a little bit tricky, or at least it was for me, reconciling the different genres that the show veers into at different times. So, for example, when you start watching it, it seems very much like a teen kind of like romantic, not to draw this comparison really, but something, it's often compared to Stranger Things, but it kind of also reminded me of like a Twilight kind of vibe where it's like there's supernatural stuff, there's like teen romance, there's kind of a love triangle at the heart of this. There are definitely moments where it's like it's a teen drama, and I love a good teen drama, like a CW show. It goes from that into something, very, very sci-fi-y, where there's a ton of plot and exposition and rule stuff that has to be delivered. It goes from that into this very dark psychological family thing. A lot of the time, it's like more living in that territory with, this like sort of sci-fi bent to it. But there's a lot of intense family, like sort of relationship conversation-y kind of things that you would expect more from just like a straight drama. And so I think because we as viewers are so conditioned to think in terms of genre, like, because actually, and one thing I think the show does incredibly well is stay pretty tonally consistent. Like, even when it's a teen show or a sci-fi show or a drama, like a family drama, when it's all three of those things, it at least is tonally consistent in the sense that it's always raining and no one smiles. There's never any jokes ever. So it at least is doing like really committed to a tone. But still, we're so trained in the way that we think about genre in terms of what we expect that I think that also ends up being potentially really difficult to navigate. Where like, I actually wish this were just a teen drama, at least at times, or like, I don't know, had maybe clearer shifts to signal to me what I was supposed to be looking for in terms of like what was about to happen, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because I definitely did feel some of that where it's kind of like there's this kind of grave, like universe ending kind of thing being weighed. And then the next scene is kind of like petty drama between the teens, which is kind of a funny shift to make. But for the most part, I felt like those transitions were pretty smooth because of, I think what you're going to get with tone maybe is there's a single director for the entire series.
Yeah.
And you can feel a continuity of just the way the cinematography makes you feel, the way the music makes you feel. There is like a singular kind of vision behind it. So even as it does a lot of different things, especially getting into like season 3, it really starts to get all over the place. There's still this kind of singular vision behind it, and that was also really exciting because that's pretty rare to have a single director, even because this is kind of more like a limited series as far as the length of each season. But I don't know of any limited series that's gone on for 3 seasons with one single director. That's pretty intense. That's a lot of work for that person.
Yeah.
So it's also kind of a remarkable show for that reason, because it has that quality that I love in long form storytelling, which is can you give me basically a movie vision, but a story that can only be told in long form.
Sure.
Yeah, it is interesting, all those points you're making, Trisha, of how it changes between genres. And I think it worked for me because I got hooked because it kind of starts off as like a murder mystery.
Definitely. Yeah.
Like,
I didn't even mention that as one of its primary genres.
That's like the big one. Yeah.
Which is definitely in there. Yeah.
Missing children in the small town and what's going to happen. And I was drawn in just by that. And then it's like, but also like there's going to be time travel. Okay. Like I'm here. But as I was thinking about it and the idea of time travel, I was kind of trying to figure out, is time travel itself a genre, or is it more just a mechanic that you can apply to other genres? And there obviously have been lots of time travel stories in lots of genres.
Yep.
I was also kind of trying to break down, if you're going to use the device of time travel, what are the categories that those stories kind of fall into? And so the 3 I was sort of arriving at was stories that are about changing the past. So like something has gone wrong, we have to go back to fix it, like Back to the Future, obviously, or Terminator, or all the Terminator films of like, you got to change the thing so the thing doesn't happen.
Right.
Or even the new Star Trek films that are like, we got to go fix it. Now we're in a new timeline. So there's time travel to change the past. And then there's kind of like time travel to change the protagonist. And so that's usually either like going to witness the past or the future, like A Christmas Carol, or It's a Wonderful Life, where it's like, we're going to show you visions of your life at different stages, and that will help change who you are. Or there's sort of like the reliving the past time loop thing, which is like Groundhog Day, obviously, or Edge of Tomorrow, or Palm Springs more recently. That's kind of another interesting way of like using time to force a character to change, which we talked about on our Groundhog Day podcast and the video. And then there's kind of this third category, which is like, rather than going to change the past or going to change the character, you're changing nothing. And those are the ones that I really like, where it's this idea of
the deterministic ones.
Yeah, well, it's the phrase from Lost, which is kind of ironic because Lost played fast and loose with all the rules, but whatever happened, happened. And so Time Crimes, which is a 2007 Spanish film, is kind of the prototypical example of that, where it's you're following this person and suddenly he's time traveling and going through all these loops. But every time he's going through a loop, quote unquote, he's becoming something that he encountered before. So everything that ever happened is happening. Or the other example I think is actually really good is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban.
Yeah.
I think it's like maybe one of the best of those time travel stories.
For sure.
And yeah, and so it's just interesting that I think all of these examples are kind of using time to examine the idea of choices and like the consequences of one's actions, using that as a way to shape characters in all these different ways. So just an interesting observation, I guess, that is cool about time travel.
Well, yeah, like the sort of, it's almost like time adventure movies or shows. Like Doctor Who does this a lot, and I think even Star Trek has done it. Like Next Generation, I feel like did it a few times, where it's like we're just going to go to a time and hang out there for an hour, and we might affect like whatever's happening in the current thing, but we're not changing the future necessarily. It's just like, let's go on a little time adventure for an episode, because why not?
Paul Thomas Anderson, Johnny Greenwood, and a 53-minute documentary about making an album. This is one of the unique and awesome films available on Mubi. Mubi is the curated streaming service featuring an ever-changing collection of hand-picked films, from new directors to award winners from everywhere on Earth. Beautiful, interesting, incredible movies, a new one every single day. I was scrolling through this eclectic list when I saw the Paul Thomas Anderson documentary, Jun-Un. I clicked on it and read the description of why Mubi had selected it. Featuring Radiohead guitarist Johnny Greenwood, Israeli musician Shai Ben-Sur, and amazing Indian artists, Paul Thomas Anderson's one-of-a-kind documentary is an intimate, eclectic, multicultural, multi-musical journey. Prepare to be uplifted. I really enjoy Paul Thomas Anderson's approach to music videos, so I decided to check out Jun-Un, and it's awesome. Great music shot in an engrossing way, it's worth checking out. And right now, it's exclusive on Mubi, which is great because you can try Mubi for free for 30 days at mubi.com/beyondthescreenplay. So head to mubi.com/beyondthescreenplay, that's mubi.com/beyondthescreenplay, to get a free month of great cinema and to check out Paul Thomas Anderson's documentary, Jun-Un. Thanks to Mubi for sponsoring Beyond the Screenplay.
And then also, I guess, beyond these kind of, I think what you're outlining, Michael, are like the story reasons to be time traveling. And there's also, I guess, maybe outside, this is outside of like story motivation, but just in raw mechanics of time travel. The other distinction I make is time travel within one reality or timeline, or time travel that is enabled precisely because you're not staying within your reality. Like Star Trek, actually, the new Star Trek movie is an example of actually not traveling within a timeline, but Spock, by time traveling, creates a new alternate reality from his very presence going back, or whoever goes back first. I forget what happened in that movie. Anyway, it was interesting because that's what was so kind of shocking to me about the end of season 2 was the show seemed to be committing very hard to a model of time travel that was taking place within one reality. You know, they precisely could not change anything because they were stuck in this one reality. And so it was really fascinating to me that the choice they made to say, no, we're not just doing that type of time travel story. This is also an alternate reality time travel story, which is a different kind, because that also usually introduces the possibility of change. Because with an alternate reality, it's like we're now saying there can be alternate versions of this world. Therefore, we can maybe create even another one if we change something else. So that was an interesting choice that the filmmakers made, and I wonder if it's a choice you kind of have to make ultimately if you want a satisfying story, because otherwise your story is just playing out the deterministic events, and you just kind of check all them off until we've seen all of them, and now the story's done. So anyway, that's just a lot of thoughts I've been having.
Yeah, and I did appreciate that. Granted, this is not the first time it's ever been done, but I did appreciate the sort of, we're used to time travel being, well, if you interact with yourself in the past, it screws everything up. And this was a show that was saying, no, it's absolutely essential to the story that characters interact with themselves and become their own grandmothers and all this kind of stuff. Because I thought it was fun to see them just completely commit to that. And you get that with Mikkel and Michael right away. is them just saying like, no, there is no really changing anything, because that wouldn't make sense, because then like people wouldn't even exist if you change something. And then, so it's like, rather than dealing with that paradox, they're just saying, no, this all exists in this loop and you can't change it. The fun episode for me was episode 4, I think, of season 2, where you have old Claudia giving H.G. Tannhaus the book that he has not yet written. And then 33 years later, young Claudia shows up and she says, I think I'm supposed to be here. And old Tannhaus is saying like, I've been waiting for this day because you many years from now will tell me. And then you also have her interacting with her father as different ages and stuff. And I was totally with the reality shifting thing too, of like, now there's alternate realities. I'm like, okay, cool. That doesn't like necessarily follow the logic we've had so far. But at the same time, it also seems like, okay, cool. Like that seems like where the show could go now. But then the thing that sort of started to bug me was when like a character tries to kill another character and like the gun literally doesn't go off. Because I'm like, okay, now you're not just saying these time loops exist. You're saying basically the universe will step in and stop something. So I'm like, what if Jonas jumps off a building? Does he float safely to the ground? Like, and I think that's where it started to.
I mean, he does try to hang himself.
Right.
And apparently, yeah, someone saves him. So.
Someone saves him. That's not the same
there
as.
There would be a net, Bri. There's a net, or
right,
there's a
exactly.
lake suddenly there. Don't worry about it.
But then at that point, the sort of rules of the world started to not feel earned quite as much.
Sure.
Or the gun just happened to jam that one time.
Right.
And the other time.
And the many times.
Because I feel like I have like the opposite reaction where like the gun not going off is like, yeah, of course it can't go off because we're in a world where you can't change anything. So like you can't kill him because he's alive. Like that's not possible. So it makes more sense to me that anytime you try to kill somebody that's already alive in the future, it's not going to work versus splitting off into this new alternate reality. But that's also because I'm a nerd. But to underline what you're saying about this idea of they really lean into the paradox idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
The bootstrap paradox, I think is what they call it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was sitting down to like watch it with my girlfriend, and it was like, okay, it's a time travel story, and I was putting on my like smart movie nerd person. I was like, in time travel stories, sometimes there's a paradox thing. It's going to be so interesting. They introduced it, and I was like, yeah, see? And then they like kept doing it, and they went so hard on it that I was like, oh, I've never seen like this, where they really, the paradox is everything. Everything is a paradox, and it is a time loop. And I think sometimes people call time travel stories time loops when really it's just a linear chronology happening
exactly
from a different perspective kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But this truly is like a loop where everyone that exists because of something that happened in the future, exists because of something that happened in the past. And that is pretty incredible.
The family trees are circular. I mean, and that was actually very interesting and actually more satisfying than I thought about where the story went, is that it ultimately kind of, this, we're getting to the end of season 3, maybe we want to hold off on this, but it felt like essentially the end of the story was like, this just shouldn't be possible. There shouldn't be these family trees that are circular. This was kind of a mistake. Cancel it, that was, and it was kind of like, it was a little bit gratifying because I was starting to feel like unnerved by how many circular family trees there were. I'm like, does this even make sense? How is this possible?
I mean, everybody is literally related to everybody else in some way.
Yeah.
Like that's a fact.
And sometimes like so directly cool. The mother, daughter, and the mother. Yeah.
Yeah. The Charlotte Elizabeth loop is wild.
Yeah.
Like I've never seen that done before in a time travel story. Yeah. Like that was like a new thing that I think is really, really cool.
I have.
Okay.
There's a movie that I don't even know if it's possible to find, but I had it on VHS when I was a kid. It's called Time Trackers from, I want to say like 1991. Ned Beatty's in it. I don't know if anybody else you would know is in it. But these people from the future go back to medieval times, but they accidentally stop in 1991, and Ned Beatty is just like this like hapless cop who they end up accidentally picking up, and he goes back to medieval times with them.
Sure.
And then they hang out in medieval times, and then one character falls in love and ends up staying there, and the characters who go back to the present realize that he was his own like ancestor, basically.
But ancestor is different from literally like I'm your daughter and your mother.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, sure, but he ended up being his own great
right. I've never seen it be like that so close, cool. That like tight a loop.
Sure,
that direct. Yeah.
Well, so my question is this then: for you guys, but especially for Alex and Michael.
Whatever.
Okay, fine, right? I'm highlighting or like singling them out because I know they've written a lot in time travel. What thematically is the appeal of time travel to you? Like, what themes does that open up for you guys to explore that is like hooks you into this kind of story so much so that you want to write using this mechanic in your own work? Just an easy question. That was a softball.
I feel like there might be differing answers, because I feel like the kind of time travel I like is this sort of deterministic. You can't change the past, like whatever happened, because given a set of circumstances, someone will always make one choice. Like, we only make choices because of what we want and the context that we're in. And so it's always going to play out the way it always has. And I think that's a challenge. Like, one of my big headings on my notes right now is third act and ending problems in deterministic time travel stories.
Right. That's not what film is about.
Right. Film is about choices. And so I think that's why, Arrival was one we talked about a little bit on Arrival, where when Eric Heiser had to adapt it, he had to remove the deterministic thing so that there could be a choice made by the Amy Adams character in that show. Devs, which is a TV show, which I won't spoil entirely, but it's it's an Alex Garland show also about determinism, and it kind of also runs into this problem of like, you get to the third act and then it's like, okay, but now people want to know what's going to happen. And if you're really doing a time travel loop deterministic story, by the end people already know what's going to happen. And that's kind of what I want. I want the maybe unsettling art house version. Like, my ideal of Dark is it ends in maybe the second season. It ends where it's just like, it's filled in all the holes, and you can then watch episode 1 again, and it just continues. Like, the whole thing is a loop you can just watch over and over and over again.
Just ends with Adam shooting Marta, just like, now you will become me. The end.
Right. Or whatever. I don't know that we need to go all the way to Adam personally, but but yeah, it is this thing with when anyone tries to tell these kinds of stories, you get to the third act and it's like, well, now something needs to happen. There needs to be some kind of surprise. And so that's usually where I end up disappointed. And I think Dark proved that it could have done the version that I wanted if it had wanted to. It basically did. So I kind of gave it a pass on the third season.
Yeah, that second to last episode is a whirlwind of determinism, basically.
Was that when they have the montage of like, now you see where everybody came from and all of it?
It's the in-between time where it's like, here they are in this, and like Celia gets brought back to the past, and then like the Hanno and Agnes are born, and like the whole like, let's fill in all the gaps. It's just a scene. Yeah. It's just a whole scenes of gap filling, basically.
Right.
One episode of that.
Isn't there like a musical montage at one point where it like starts to show scenes from past seasons, and now you understand the context for them?
Oh, yeah.
That was like a big
I think that is also at
three.
the end of that episode. Yeah.
I was like, all right, Dark.
There's definitely a musical montage at one point.
Can confirm.
I love those. I have such a soft spot for dark musical montages.
The annoying thing is it reminded me of Lost. Like, and it has nothing, who cares? Like, any show can do that or whatever. But I was like, oh, you're reminding me of a show that did question mark stuff that bothered me. But that's not to say that like I had a problem with the musical montage as much as I was like, I don't want to be reminded of it.
Did Lost have lots of like interesting song choice musical montages?
I don't know about interesting song choice, but it had
a lot of TV shows were.
Yeah, right. It's kind of just like an aughts style thing. Where like at the end of
I was kind of nostalgic for in a way, so it was kind of like nice when Dark brought it back. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this.
But to end my monologue about getting to what you were actually asking about is the thematic thing. That I think that I like the idea of thinking about determinism because I think generally as a culture we overestimate our choices. Like, we put more emphasis on, I did this, I earned this, like it was my hard work that let me go to here. And we kind of minimize the context and the environment that allows you to make the choices that you make. And so I think that's the things that I like that come out of thinking about this kind of deterministic version of the world, is that you might have made cool choices, but also your position, everything around you, everything that came before you allowed you to be in a place where you could make those decisions also. And I think that has lots of sociopolitical, economic ramifications in our world.
Sure. So. That's a great answer to my question. Alex?
Like mine is not nearly as deep.
Time travel cool?
I agree with all of Michael's ideas there. And I part of why we were kind of aligned on a lot of our time travel writing was because I thought it was more interesting to attempt a story in which characters feel like they're making free choices, and maybe they are, but whatever choices they're making are creating the past to then make the present or the future from whence they came. And one of the ways I got around the third act problem in my feature was really just trying to make it, at the end of the day, like an emotional character story in which the emotional growth character choice for the protagonist was to make sure that the things happened as they happened, which is actually an interesting thing in Dark. It's like, it almost got tiresome where how many times people are saying, you got to go do this, not for any really particular reason, except for it has to happen this way. It has to happen this way. Like, it was a little bit like...
That's the danger of it.
Yeah, like that works maybe, once again in a feature where that's not going to happen too many times, but over the course of 3 seasons, it's a lot. It's a lot of Adam and Eva making sure things happen a certain way just because
and that was kind of one of my issues with it. And I think that the thing that we want, or at least we tend to want from any like film or TV, is to like go through the process vicariously of change, where we like look at a bunch of circumstances and how they affect a character. And then we know the character, so it's like, it's the entire thing. You like have a character, you get to know them, you see their flaws, you see their strengths, and then you see like a perfectly put together plot that like walks them along an internal journey of change. The problem with the mechanic of time travel is that it can potentially rob characters of having to do the like psychological work of arriving at a certain conclusion, right? And that's exactly what you guys are talking about. That gets, for me, like hard to stay invested in, because what I care about is the characters, and especially by the time we get into season 3 of Dark, I'm so hooked into what everybody wants and who they care about and why. And like, those are the stories that to me are just so heart, wrenching. And which, I was like, how are they going to like justify this in dialogue? And then it turns out the dialogue is, but that's how it happened. So go on.
Right. Right.
Part of me is like, touche, show. You didn't try to like do a bunch of, BS character work when there's only plot work to be done. But I kind of wished for the character work to be present at, at least to a degree that I would find meaningful. And I think that just has to do with like the psychology of who we are as audience members and what we watch movies and TV for. What do we watch them for?
Right.
What do they do for us psychologically? And if it's hard for me to imagine this person, but like if you are watching movies and TV because time travel cool and you don't care about if a character changes or experiences like a real dive into themselves and their worldview and their psychology and all of that stuff, then I think that like this show knocks it out of the park. I think for me though, I'm such a character and theme person that I was just like, I want the deep personal work and the deep personal change, rather than moving pieces on a chessboard, which are moved immaculately, but are also moved.
Well, and I will say that I think the show does pull that off, especially in season 1 and even through a lot of season 2, where it's like the characters are making choices not because somebody's telling them to. They really are going on those inner journeys to really dark places and making interesting decisions that are surprising and character revealing. So I think it's really mostly just season 3 for me, and some of season 2 where you get into a lot of like instruction, like here's the book, do what the book says kind of stuff. But I will also say, just to kind of finish answering your earlier question, Trisha, I am probably that person who is time travel cool. I am just very excited by any kind of like narrative experience where I'm enjoying kind of the top level story, and then boom, you realize, oh my God, that was just like 10% of what's actually happening. There's 90% below the surface that we already figured out, and we've been like waiting to show you later that will actually give new context to the 10%. And time travel stories are a really great mechanic to do that kind of, that mystery box storytelling where you can have an initial kind of narrative that can be linear and compelling and character driven. Basically, what I always want from these kind of mystery box shows or movies is for it to tell me after I'm already satisfied, wait a minute, there's so much more, and we've already figured it out. We're not even making it up as we go along. We've already figured it out. We knew it the whole time. That weird thing that happened in episode 1, we know why that happens. And like, for some reason, when I realize a creator has like done that to me narratively, like that's just my happy place. I'm just like, you just like got me, because
it's a magic trick. Yeah,
it's a magic trick, and I think I just like magic tricks that are this epic, and so I had continuous like pleasurable like magic trick reactions throughout this show, and that was part of why I was just so happy watching it.
Yeah, I will say I think one of the best episodes in it, and definitely like far and away my favorite episode. And maybe you guys can remind me exactly which number it is, because I meant to look it up and I did not. But it's the one where we finally see Jonas goes like back in time to the summer. And
Yes.
it's that summer episode, and it's him and Martha at the lake, and they're all like in the lake having fun, and getting to like, it's all that teen stuff. And then we start to see how Jonas and Martha got together in the first place.
Right.
That to me is like the pinnacle of what this show does, which is all of the character work. We see all of this like really deep like struggle within the character of Jonas, because we see both sides of him, like the Jonas that knows what the future holds and the Jonas that doesn't. We see him watch himself make a choice that he doesn't agree with and regrets, where he like walks away and just leaves her there. And then he steps in to like course correct that, even though he also has all of this other knowledge about what's wrong in their relationship potentially, which is that she's his aunt. But sorry, it's an insane
the arc of how I felt about that.
It's just
right.
It's
and then there's
wild.
like an age difference for a while when it's like adult Jonas and her, and
But I just feel like that's when the show is firing on all cylinders, where it's doing all the character work and it's doing all the time travel stuff at the same time. It's really compelling. Go ahead, Bri.
It's episode 2-6.
Thank you so much. What's it called?
An Endless Cycle.
An Endless Cycle. That episode is really beautiful. It's also the one that has, I think, the least misery.
Right. There's sunlight. I think you see the sun a little bit.
Right.
But there's like a happy party and everything. Like there's like
you
a party
happening. You can see Lewis
happening.
Hoffman's freckles on his face. You're like, look at you. You're like a winsome young person. It's like so rarely happens in the show.
In love with your aunt.
Yeah.
It is interesting how like as soon as you realize he's in love with his aunt, I'm thinking Game of Thrones, right?
Right.
That just happened. And so it's like, for a while I was like, I don't know about this. And then the show, I feel like, just makes this decision where it's like, no, we're going to, like, this is the love story. You're going to like it.
Yeah.
And it just like beats you over the head with it. Where I guess I do want them to be together.
I was kind of fine with it.
Guess.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Like by the end, it's like the weirdest part of all of it, or the least weird part about all of it.
Yeah,
so.
right.
Sure.
Just thinking about the themes and stuff of time travel. Personally, I don't write time travel stuff because I will have brain failure if I try to actually like solve the paradox.
Legit.
But I do think that two of the themes that you see a lot are, one is the theme of regret, of I wish I could go back and change this thing. Dark actually references H.G. Wells' The Time Machine quite a bit, like the entire 1880s style and everything, that sort of steampunk style. You have obviously H.G. Tannhaus.
Right.
At some point they go, I assume, to the like way future, like they do in The Time Machine, when they come out and it's just all desert and Martha meets her older self for the first time. And then the story at the heart of The Time Machine is that the main character is trying to go back in time to save his loved one from being killed.
I also love that it's like a dinner party. Sorry, just going back to like H.G. well as the time machine, but it starts and almost nearly ends at a dinner party where the guests are assembled and the time traveler is not there. And so the book is told from the perspective of one of the dinner guests that's kind of like recounting what he's like, I went to this dinner party, the host wasn't there. Then when he showed up, he told us this crazy story of why he was late.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because he was like time traveling and all of this stuff. And so it's like a frame story for the rest of the book, which I find to be a really interesting reference here to the final scene of Dark. But
well, maybe I'm just thinking, I'm remembering specifically the not very good Guy Pearce movie where it's that his loved one is killed and then he has to go back in time, but then he ends up like a billion years in the future. Mm-hmm. So when they come out and it's like the desert, I'm like, oh, it must be a billion years in the future. I just assume it is because like there's no tree stumps or anything.
Right.
Or it's just a world where it's like the apocalypse made it be a sandy.
I think that was the alternate reality apocalypse, which for some reason resulted in sand instead of clouds.
Different,
possibly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess maybe if like 33-year-older Martha is there, maybe that's where she actually lives and is from. But I just because there were so many references to the time machine, I was just like, I assume Morlocks are going to show up at some point. But yeah, so this theme of regret and wanting to change something in the past, but then also the theme of like power. If you look at Groundhog Day or Edge of Tomorrow, like a time loop thing, it's like what you're watching these characters do is gain power by the knowledge they have of what is going to happen now. So it's like instead of being clairvoyant, you are basically clairvoyant by going back and seeing something that has already happened. So I think just those are interesting things to play with.
I wonder if that's what inspired Stephen Hawking to throw a time travel party.
A dinner party. Yeah, like I invite you all to arrive at this date.
Right.
Did he show up late and then have a story about why he was late?
Well, no. He had a party. It was all decorated, everything. This was in 2009. And so it was like the champagne party for time travelers. But he sent out the invites afterward and wanted to make sure that everyone would know about it afterward and long into the future. So that if anyone ever in the future got the invitation, they would know where to go and what time to go to. But no one ever showed up. And so it kind of proves that at least no one ever time travels to Stephen Hawking's party.
Not in this reality, anyway.
Well, reality.
So the takeaway here is that the creators of Dark were inspired by The Time Machine, the 2002 film starring Guy Pearce.
Isn't Samantha Mumba in that also? Okay.
Correct.
That's the thing I remember the most about that.
So while we're here, can we talk about the ending for like a little bit?
Yes, please.
I was.
Because this entire experience just led me down a line of thought in my own mind where I was like, how in the world can we end things in a way that feels satisfying? What does that look like? What would this look like? What is potentially dissatisfying about this to me? And for that, I think I have an answer, which is just I don't like determinism and I want people to be happy at the end of my stories. So my answer as to why
the
I
opposite
find this,
of Michael.
I don't know. I just find it, the final scene, which is at this dinner party, and you have most people who are not paradoxes,
right,
make it to this dinner party of whom there are 6. There are, in theory, a few other people that are not paradoxes that like could be there. So actually, Bartosz is not a paradox. Like he could exist. Or is that who I'm thinking of? I think it's Bartosz.
Yeah.
His parents probably didn't meet because Ulrich wasn't around. Yeah.
Right.
But like most of the people who are not paradoxes make it to this Stephen Hawking style dinner party, and they are just sort of talking about, their lives and whatever. Jonas's mother, Hannah, is pregnant yet again with somebody else's baby, this time Waller's baby.
Yeah.
God bless Waller.
Look, he finally caught a break.
Right.
Yeah.
That poor guy.
Although she thinks about naming that kid Jonas, so it's like, all right. But she sort of, veers into this nihilistic place where she talks about a dream that she had and says, everything went dark, the lights went out, everything went dark. And we didn't exist, nothing existed, and it was beautiful and good, essentially, which is, very sharp nihilism. existence is pain and suffering, and so like non-existence, like I think it's called eternal oblivion is the Socratic like term for it. But anyway, for me, I'm never going to find something like that satisfying because it's just not what I want from endings. Like I'd like to see my characters change and then like live into a future that's where they have to then like follow that change a little ways. And so I think that's the thing for me about Jonas and Martha here, where they make a choice that ends everything, but then they don't have to live in that choice. That choice leads to their non-existence. And so I would have preferred to see what might happen on the other side of that choice if these people continue to exist. Because I think just in terms of like, I am a human, I am bound by time. Cathartically, I think it's worth it to see what happens after we make dramatically different choices because of change. You know, this sort of, again, like what TV shows or movies can do for us on a personal level. That being said, I have no idea how I would have landed this plane. I'm not sure there is a good way to land this plane. And so I just love to like get your thoughts on all of this.
So for me, I mean, the ending is a lot to talk about. But
yes,
just talking about the dinner party part of it. I actually really liked that final scene because I feel like it did give me kind of a happy ending in a way that the more just it's best if we all don't exist kind of final montage didn't. And I think what I liked about it was this is more just like a clever thing, but it almost kind of put it out there that maybe the sense of deja vu we have sometimes, maybe those weird feelings we have sometimes are just alternate realities burst into existence, then suddenly destroyed themselves. And we never really knew about it, but we can kind of just feel it happening. I thought it was a fun way to like all this insane stuff just happened over the course of 3 seasons, but maybe within this one reality, it was just kind of a weird deja vu feeling this one person had because it all just self-destructed and went away. So I thought, as far as like an actual final note to end it on, I thought it was kind of a simple, sweet, interesting button with that kind of unnerving twist of like, I'm going to name him Jonas for some reason. I had this idea in my head. So I liked how it ended in that final dinner scene. I think there was a way in which things were visualized in the destruction of the 2 like wrong realities that did kind of rub me the wrong way. And I think maybe it's just necessary for just having an emotional goodbye to the characters. But I think when it veered into like, we're going to show people like dissolving into bits, or we're going to be kind of like Marta and Jonas are going to be standing in kind of like a desktop screensaver world for a while, like to look at their childhood selves. Like, I think that's where the show kind of it was a little disappointing for me because up until that point it seemed pretty dedicated to it was there's definitely not hard sci-fi stuff going on. There's like big goopy balls of dark energy or whatever, that's not hard science fiction, but it still felt like it was playing within a world where there's kind of like a grittiness to it, and the ending felt a bit magical compared to the rest. And so I guess if I were to change anything about the ending, just because I don't know what I would change about what actually happened, because it's like this was the story they were telling the whole time. It obviously was all leading to this. I would have visualized it, I think, differently, or maybe made it feel a bit different to be more in line with the way the show felt up to that point. So it did feel like by the end we were kind of in more magic territory and not as much this kind of hard grounded sci-fi territory.
Yeah.
Those are all my rambly thoughts.
I don't have a solid answer about how I would have wanted it to end, but what I do wonder, I have no doubt that they had this all planned out from the beginning. What I do wonder is if it was supposed to be 3 seasons versus maybe an extended amount of time. What I liked about the first 2 seasons was every reveal was sort of built on your existing knowledge. So it's like, if you can travel 33 years in the past, you can travel 66 years in the past. Now you can travel 33 years in the future, 99 years in the past. Like, okay, fine. And then it's like every kind of step. But if you can do that, and if Mikkel goes back, he can become this other character who we know from the present. Okay, fine. Like everything sort of felt like it was earned. And then the 3rd season really just started throwing rules at you fast and loose. And I wonder if if maybe they were hoping for, let's say, 4 seasons where they could sort of introduce the second reality and then in the last season sort of take all these rules and slowly build them towards a finale. But it just felt like in 8 episodes, it was like breakneck speed, new characters, new rules, new not new characters, but like new ages of existing characters and new alternate reality.
Well, new creepy child across
Right,
3
yes,
ages
yes.
for
Right.
some reason.
Right.
The unholy trinity is what I call them.
Yeah. So it just felt like a lot, and I wonder if the ending, if they could have stuck the landing better, if they had spent more time earning it, basically.
Yeah, I have kind of like 2 thoughts there, where it's like I think for me, honestly, as soon as they were like, actually, there's an alternate reality, I was like, okay, well, the show's over now, and I'm gonna keep watching to see what they do with it. But as soon as it was like, there's magic, I was like, okay, well, I feel like this kind of starts to invalidate everything I was feeling before. So I feel like it's kind of like what you were saying, Alex, but just a more extreme reaction of as soon as you add magic, it becomes a different thing. So I wasn't really emotionally moved by anything in the 3rd season by and large, but everything up to that I thought was cool. And I think the question I would want to know from the creators is, was that 3rd season definitely there the whole time? Was an alternate reality definitely there the whole time? Because it does come on pretty quick, where it's like a couple episodes from the ending, it's like, actually, I know we've been telling you can't change anything for 20 episodes, 24 episodes, but actually,
there's a loophole.
You can. There's a loophole. And now you have to care about that. And again, I think it is clever. And like you said, Trisha, the chess pieces and the way they moved are immaculate and really impressive and all those things. It reminded me of Game of Thrones, where I was thinking about the same thing that you were saying, Brian, of like, if they'd had more time, would they have been able to create that same level of character investment? So it's not just Lost style plot, answer. But I wonder if there's also just a certain level of fatigue that can happen in these kind of puzzle mystery box shows and stories. And I kind of compare it to when you're putting together a jigsaw puzzle. At the beginning, you're overwhelmed because it's just a bunch of pieces and you don't know where they go. And eventually you find a structure and it's like, okay, I have my footing. And then you're starting to place pieces and then you're kind of getting into a rhythm and there's this momentum happening. It's like, okay, we're putting the puzzles like together. It's happening. And then I feel like for me anyway, when I put together puzzles, as I get to the end, it's like, well, I pretty much see the full picture now. Like it's just the mechanics of, well, I got to go get that piece and put it in. And by the last couple of pieces, you're like, I'm just going through the motions here because then I can say I'm done. And so I feel like there's probably this pull of like, when you start to feel that in your story, you go, well, actually, this puzzle is just one piece in a bigger puzzle. But no matter how many puzzles you create and extrapolate from there, you're still going to have that problem. As you get to the end, if all you're relying on is puzzle pieces, there's going to be fatigue as you get closer.
Well, and all of this reminds me of something that I think we talked about in the Blade Runner podcast, which I think it was the Blade Runner podcast, but we were actually getting into like mysteries in general and the forms that mysteries take. And we were talking about this Raymond Chandler book, which is, I think it's The Long Goodbye, might be that one. But anyway, Chandler was notorious for tying too many knots into his plots, basically, and not really knowing where they were going, right? Because as a creator, there is something really fascinating about confounding your own plans. And like, well, what if this person suddenly shows up and provides a new piece of information? There's something really fun about kind of tying your own knots in your own story threads. I used to do this all the time with my sister when we were growing up. We would like create mysteries where we're like, this thing in the house is a clue. Well, what could it mean? Maybe it leads us to this. And then we'd like fill whole notebooks full of like clues. And then sometimes we would get into really interesting, and characters, of course, we would create characters. And we would get into really interesting places where sometimes things would actually fit together perfectly. Where we're like, this thing actually led us to that clue. And that clue points to this imaginary character that we had already created that did this other thing. And it actually perfectly unites. And it's amazing when that happens. The result of that kind of storytelling is that often you're left with plot threads that don't tie together neatly, as in some of our most classic mysteries. The reverse side is You have a plot that ties together completely, perfectly, and impeccably, but it leaves some character stuff potentially out to dry. And so I think that is like a constant sort of thing you have to hold in two hands. And I think that short form storytelling lends itself, like film, lends itself to you're able to hold them both at the same time as you set out on the journey. And so you know exactly where it's going. You're crafting the character arc and the character work and everything change exactly towards the plot, right? Like the plot is crafted to lead you to this one place that resolves both of those things. X marks the spot immediately perfectly. I think that the nature of TV and longer form storytelling is that you end up either letting some character stuff drop through the cracks or some plot stuff drop through the cracks. Backing up a few seconds. In an ideal world, both of those things, thank you. In an ideal world, both of those things are theme, right? The plot, the characters lead you to the same place in terms of theme, and there you are. I think the thing for me that's really interesting about Dark is that in order for the plot to wrap up neatly and the theme to resolve neatly, like the show is pitting the theme against the characters because they can't both have a satisfying ending or like they can't both have a happy ending because thematically is existence suffering and therefore we don't want it, or like is it worth it despite the fact that existence is suffering? Those are kind of like that's sort of the question that the show is asking thematically in the Adam and Eve storylines, right? Like Eve is saying like, yes, this child that I'm going to have is the devil apparently. But I still care enough about him to make this time loop happen over and over again. And Adam is like, it's absolutely not worth it. Absolutely not. We have to continue to destroy it. And that in itself, that tension in itself is what creates like this, never ending loop. So in order for that to resolve thematically, though, you basically have to just send your characters into oblivion and therefore, like, for me, not provide them with a satisfying resolution in the way that I was talking about. Like, to resolve the show plot in terms of plot and theme, you can't resolve the show in terms of character.
I agree. Yeah.
Right? Because it's like, living is harder. It's harder to live. It would be a lot harder to find a happy ending for Jonas and Martha if they continued to live. And the rest of the characters. It'd be harder for Charlotte and Elizabeth to find a happy ending. It'd be hard. It'd be hard / impossible for any of that to actually happen. It's much harder. And that's kind of what I was hoping I might see is that really difficult work. Not that the plot itself is not a feat, because it is.
Well, and I think because of the nature of the show, we've already seen future versions of them. So I think it makes it that much harder, like you're saying, to be like, well, no, in this new happy ending they've created, we promise they won't end up like all these other ways that we've seen them. That might just get in the way of for me, I think it would have gotten in the way of it's a happy ending where they've changed, where I feel like I would always be wondering, but like, did they? Like, it complicates it.
Right.
It's such a strange example for this kind of, if you want an ending where it's like the characters have changed and now they're challenged to move forward in life, we get to see most of these characters like across the span of like a century at different points in their lifespans. And so in some ways, it almost felt like the only way the show, could go after showing us everything was oblivion of like, we've seen exactly where they came from, where they'll end up, the whole course of their lives. And so, basically either this is going to just keep going on in this loop or we're going to destroy it. And I thought it was an interesting choice to kind of almost say like this was a mistake. These realities like are kind of a mistake, and there's maybe like more suffering than normal in them for some reason because of the mistake. That seems to be implied by the show sometimes, or even Claudia. It's like she seems to be convinced that her daughter is going to have a better life in the original reality than in these kind of like perverted realities. So I don't know. It was definitely third season was not at all anything I could have expected, but by that point, the creators had earned my confidence in the sense that I knew they were masterful creators, and wherever they wanted to tell me, I was kind of just down to go with it and let them take me there. So it was interesting experience watching season 3 because season 2 finale with that twist of the alternate realities kind of, like you said, Michael, kind of ended the frame of mind I was watching it in. And season 3 was I kind of just let it wash over me in a different way from seasons 1 and 2, where I wasn't pausing as often to try to figure things out. I was more just let's see where this goes. And overall, I still just have pretty much nothing but warm feelings towards the people behind the show and just what they did. I'm just in awe of it. So
yeah.
Can we also appreciate that the third season came out on June 27th, 2020?
I was
we can.
Yeah. And it's an appropriate year for the apocalypse.
Oh, for real.
Yeah, the last thing I wanted to say, which is a little bit what you were saying, Trisha, about sort of building this mystery and everything, and less about character and theme. For me, there's a thing about how many questions are in my head at one time.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about Lost, and another show that came to mind is Westworld, where just shows where I feel like I have all these questions and it takes too many episodes for there to be an answer. And sometimes there are no answers and there's just new questions. And it's not, like I was saying, always built on my previous knowledge. It's just like, here's a brand new thing that exists now. And the thing with Westworld that I am reminded of is the first episode basically tells you you're not going to have any idea what's going on, because you see James Marsden, you think he's a human, and then he dies, and then you see him again and you're like, oh, he's a synthetic or whatever they're called in the show, a robot. So it's like basically within the first 20 minutes of the show, it's like, don't bother trying to figure anything out because you're not going to. So then after maybe 2 episodes, I was at a party with some friends, and one of my friends said, oh, I heard this theory that Jeffrey Wright is actually a robot. And I was like, yeah, anything might be anything. And like, that's not like suddenly, and that's kind of true of Dark, of like, sometimes I'm watching the show, a new character shows up and I'm like, we haven't seen Adult Bartaj yet. Maybe this is Adult Bartaj. Maybe this is Mads, who's actually, didn't whatever. And I think Dark did it well, even though there were those moments where I just felt like overwhelmed by the fact that anybody might be anybody from a different time and then later a different reality and whatever. I did appreciate that I never had too many questions in my head at once. And usually if I had a question, it would be answered within the next couple episodes and there would be new questions, but I always felt like there was like a manageable amount of mystery in my brain at any given time. I think that like I've used the comparison before of dramatic tension sort of being like holding a piece of yarn out of a cat's reach to get him to, engage with it. And to me, something like Westworld is basically like throwing a sweater on a cat and saying like, have fun. There you go.
A great visualization.
Right.
I agree with you so much, because I think what you're talking about there, you've identified a real problem I have with shows like Westworld, Lost, all these things where, there's not a good pacing of answers to questions. Whereas Dark, somehow they really wove like a perfect pace of, you never felt like you were being strung along for too long before you got a really juicy piece of information or the answer to a question. And so it was a continually satisfying experience as opposed to a constantly frustrating experience of like, okay, another question on top of the 20 I already have. You may never answer any of them. Who knows?
Right.
Yeah. It gave you a lot of faith that you were going to get your answers because they were answering them so consistently.
Right. And the very last thing we have to mention is the insane casting of the same characters at different ages.
Yes. Like,
that
what?
was really impressive.
It looked like they were actually the same people.
Yeah. I thought Ulrich was in makeup. Like old Ulrich. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just had to throw that out there because I could.
I mean, just and so amazing. I mean, like they did a lot of work, obviously, with the design of the characters where they show up and it's like, oh, you have the same hair. And or you are, whatever, like you have the scar or you have the this or that, like with Helga. It's still like they gave you those visual cues for some of the characters, but with some of the other characters, like I thought older Magnus and Franziska were like really well cast.
Older Magnus blew my mind.
Yes, it's crazy. I was like, that's him.
Yeah.
The fact that they were able to do that, I actually wrote a movie that's sort of about time travel, but we had to cast actors as like the older actors, right? We had young adults playing the characters at one age and much older adults playing them like in their 60s.
Mm-hmm.
It is very hard to do. And I cannot believe the level of precision and also just like talent from every member of the cast. Yes.
It wasn't like
Right.
they had to make a concession to like cast the
No.
right look, but like a crappy actor. Like it was the performances across the board are fantastic. And I thought even some of the characters, the younger, older versions, they captured like the essence of each other in their performances to a degree that was like above and beyond. I just couldn't believe it.
Yeah, for sure.
It is pretty incredible. One of the many incredible things about the show. And yeah, I think it is just, there's still just so many questions that I have about shows like this, mystery box shows. Like, is it possible to do it? Or is the best thing you can hope for is to make it as fun an experience and as palatable as possible while going through, and not just frustration after frustration. And yeah, endings are really hard. So maybe sometimes it's better to just stop. Why don't we go around and say what lessons we're going to take?
Anyway, goodbye, everybody.
It's just the episode just ends.
Brian, what lesson you're going to take away from Dark?
Bear with me for a second, because I was reminded of multiple other shows that I have enjoyed that have some sort of sci-fi or supernatural element to them over the past several years. And interestingly, they're from all around the world. There's Dark, which is a German show. There's Les Revenants, which is a French show remade in American as The Returned, but the remake apparently was not good, not worth watching. But I love that show. And like, if you watch 2 seconds of that show, you will see how similar it is to Dark, just in tone and like cinematography and everything. That show is like kids who were killed in a car accident 4 years later, I think, suddenly just wake up and come home and like nothing ever happened. And of course, the parents are freaking out, but the kids are like, what happened? What's wrong? Humans, which is a British show based on a Swedish show called Real Humans, which is sort of there are AI robots we can buy and bring home and be our servants and stuff. But then some of them are sentient and they're like rebelling and all this kind of thing. And then there's a Canadian show called Orphan Black, where the incredible Tatiana Maslany plays several different clones of the same character who have different accents and personalities and everything. So each of those shows has a sort of sci-fi or supernatural element to it. But what I loved about all of them is that they were, as we were saying earlier, these sort of very personal storylines. They usually take place in like a small town where people know each other, and there are like, will they, won't they, and someone is missing, and someone just really needs a personal, visceral thing that we could all connect to. Meanwhile, there is this weird sci-fi supernatural kind of thing going on. And I think that like that's what makes those shows so appealing, is that even though you're like trying to figure out this bigger mystery, you are just following this very simple storyline of, oh, what does it mean if you see yourself on a subway station and then the other you kills herself, and then you're like left trying to solve this mystery of why is there another you in the world, which is the first 5 minutes of Orphan Black, which I'm like, yep, I'm watching this show now. But then what happens with almost all of these shows is as the show progresses, it gets into this like big territory of there's this organization or cult or something where the people made the mysterious thing and they've been controlling it all along. And now they have a secret thing that you didn't know about. And we have to go infiltrate the headquarters to do a thing. And there's nothing inherently wrong with any of that. But I just think that it makes it a lot harder for the shows to have that sort of personal connection to it. And if you look at Dark season 1, which is a lot of just like character work, versus Dark season 3, where they still handle it pretty well, but there is a lot of like, now there are these 2 organizations that each have their own plans and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying Dark is a bad example of this, but it's always trying to find that balance and keep it sort of personal. So I think it feels like a screenwriting 101 thing to say, like, make your characters care about something personal. But I think it just gets harder to map sometimes over the course of like an entire series, where it's like, now we're introducing more characters and a bigger story. And like, we have to eventually land this thing and tie it all together. And I think that it's just the biggest lesson for me is trying to keep it as personal and familiar to the audience, where they can like latch on to one thing and say, that's a thing that I personally care about, while I'm also seeing how this giant mystery web unfolds and everything. So yeah, that was my biggest takeaway.
Yeah. Hello, listener. I have some exciting news to share. So, I've always loved video games. Mass Effect, The Last of Us, Metal Gear Solid, The Witcher 3, Horizon Zero Dawn, the list goes on. And it seems like every year, games are finding new and more refined ways of telling stories in their unique medium. So for a while now, the team and I have been developing a new video series devoted to analyzing and exploring storytelling in video games. It's called Story Mode, and the first 2 episodes are available to watch today on Nebula. If you're not familiar with Nebula, it's a streaming service developed by creators to be a place where we can house our content ad-free and experiment with original content, just like Story Mode. Nebula features a lot of great creators, including Just Right, Lindsay Ellis, Thomas Frank, Patrick Willems, Tom Scott, and tons of others. To sign up for Nebula, just head to watchnebula.com and then be sure to check out our new Nebula original series, Story Mode. The first episode looks at the game The Outer Worlds to see how companion characters affect the player, and the second episode dives into Outer Wilds to explore how games can spark curiosity. And there are even more episodes on the way, so sign up for Nebula today to make sure you don't miss them. And now, back to the episode. Trisha?
Yeah, my lesson is about something that I want to interrogate further in my own writing, which is the show's treatment of Hannah. Because Hannah really upset me as a character, because she behaves in all kinds of ways that we tend to find bad is the word I'm gonna go with. It's morally reprehensible. But basically she acts like a bad guy, or if you just looked at a list of things that Hannah does in the show, it is not good. She goes back in time just to taunt her lover and let him know that she knows where he is and she's not going to help him. That's pretty extreme, Hannah.
It's next level.
Yeah. I mean, that is some trolling in a crazy way. And of course, the first minute that we meet Hannah, she's having an affair with a married man. Her husband has recently killed himself. And she's just sleeping with Ulrich, who was her high school boyfriend, but definitely, or not even her high school boyfriend, just a guy that she was obsessed with.
Crush. Yeah.
And then she time travels in different realities to have affairs with other married men and blackmails people to ruin the lives of the other women that the men that she loves are sleeping with. It's quite a lot. But I could tell as I watched the show, and it made me very uncomfortable, that the show wasn't judging her for anything that she was doing. The way that she's treated in the show, I think partially because she's Jonas's mother. And Jonas is, of course, it's an ensemble cast, but Jonas is the main character. And we know how much Jonas cares about her. And she is a good mother. We don't see her doing a lot of mothering, but we're just assuming that she and Jonas have a good relationship and she is a good mother. That's part of the reason I think that it doesn't feel like the show judges her actions. But another part of the reason is just because the show doesn't judge her actions, right? We typically see judgment, and we've been talking about quote unquote morals in filmmaking recently in a couple of different episodes, Trainspotting, and then also in Mad Men, we were talking about how do we reconcile our morals with the morals of the characters on the show. And I think that often narrative forms tend to adhere to a traditional moral sense or moral code, in that people who do bad things usually happen to them. Or if bad things don't happen to them, they're at least unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
Gwyneth Paltrow and Contagion.
Hannah never actually seems that conflicted or unhappy about any of her actions. And nothing bad really happens to her, except, of course, the way that she dies eventually. Right. Which is pretty awful. But I could tell as I was watching the show that the show was just letting her be.
Yeah.
It made me uncomfortable. I did not like it. But then I read an interview with Jante Fries, the writer of the show, and I was like, I bet this woman, the writer, loves this character. And sure enough, I have a quote from her. I love her, said Fries. She loves Hannah. As with every character in Dark, when you're sure you know who the villain is or who's doing the bad thing, you should be open for what made them that way. No one is just evil because they want to be. Everyone is reacting to their own hurts and wounds. The past shapes you in everything that happens. And so ultimately the design of Hannah is something thematic, which is about this pain is determinism kind of thing, without locking her into a traditional villain role. She's not an antagonist in the sense that she's not fighting with the hero. for the goal of the thing. She just is acting according to her own pain and desires in sort of a tertiary way, but in a way that ultimately says something thematic. And I just think it's really fascinating. And I don't know what the lesson is about that, other than I can't remember the last time that I saw a character like that wasn't in some way being judged for their actions by the show itself or by the show's creators. And I just think it's like, this is kind of the perfect show on which to explore that. Really respect it.
I do feel like she's one of the most interesting characters.
For sure.
Where like
Absolutely. I love Hannah.
Every time she did something, I was like, you're like, she's a crazy person, but like, I kind of love this character. Like, I'm always, whenever she's on screen, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm curious to see, like, I don't know what's gonna happen. And
yeah, it's like juicy. It was great.
The show doesn't feel like it's judging the character, which I think is cool. I appreciate that.
And even though in the like splinter realities, she meets a horrifying end, she makes it through the show.
Right.
She's not a paradox.
She's kind of like the focus of the final scene.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
Although, yeah, that final scene almost has that like the horror movie ending of like what, have you thought of a name?
Oh yeah.
I think Jonas is a lovely name. Credits.
Rosemary's Baby.
It's like end of Thriller, and it's like she has cat eyes.
Right.
Alex, lessons.
Mine was kind of basically Brian's. So I mean, I think I'll just add on. It's very easy to write a mystery. Well, it's not easy, but it's easy to get so caught up in your mystery box that you forget to have like in the moment real-time reasons for characters to be doing things.
Yeah.
And I think Dark, even in season 3, you know, there was the annoying acceleration of just do this because the book says so or because I told you so. There are still a lot of like revelations in season 3 that reveal why characters are motivated to take the actions they've taken. You know, learning that Noah basically lived a long time in that post-apocalyptic future, had a baby, and then had the baby stolen, and then was driven to change the reality to get his baby back. That's a really interesting revelation that changes the way you look at him going back and rewatching seasons 1 and 2.
For sure.
And I think Dark was just so good about every character's motivation, for the most part, is an identifiable, clear, emotional, real-time thing they're going after. And because of that, you don't have to be a super wonky time travel person to get sucked in by season 1, because you understand this is a father looking for his child. This is a mother looking for her child. Like very raw, simple character motivations. And so, yeah, the Dark, once again, we've talked about how that kind of slipped a bit towards the end, but I think more than other mystery box shows that have gone on this long, it really kept up that in the moment character motivation that keeps you engaged. You're watching for more than I have 50 questions, when are they going to answer them? You have an in the moment present reason to keep watching.
Yeah, I feel like that is kind of just largely the takeaway, and pretty much my lesson too. And I had the opportunity recently to chat with Kelsey Beecham, who is one of the writers of the video game Outer Wilds. And she had this thing that she said that I really liked, which is that, I can't stand in forms of media. I don't like it when the movie feels like they're trying to outwit the audience. I don't like surprises for surprise's sake. And so what she's done to combat that is like make it a cool payoff in a different way. So like if it's going to be something where maybe the audience is going to say, see, I called it. Don't just make it an informational payoff, make it an emotional payoff. Like give it an emotional punch.
I love that.
And I think that's just really great writing or advice for writers.
Yeah.
I have an amazing story for that real quick. Both the creators of Game of Thrones and Rian Johnson with Last Jedi, they had like these really interesting quotes about audience expectations. And like Rian Johnson was like, we have to give them what they don't want, but in a way that they like or whatever. And it's like, and Mark Hamill was just like, no, we should give them what they want. Right. And it's just, so it's been this interesting kind of conversation around like, do you just give people what they want? And I had this stupid revelation at Cirque du Soleil. I'm a Luna.
Okay.
Where I'm watching a juggler and he's juggling and he's finally like done with his like whole craziness, and he throws one ball up in the air and it's coming down, and you have enough times it's coming down to say like, okay, he's going to catch it. Like that's going to be the end. He's going to catch it. And we're going to applause and da-da-da. And then he darts his head forward and catches it on the back of his neck. And I was like, I don't know why, but I just went, that's what you want. You want the thing that you expect, but in a way that you didn't expect.
Mm-hmm.
Or, I mean, even that is, there's an emotion that comes with that, you know, he's showing off even more skill than you thought he had, you know, so there's more of an impact of the surprise. Yeah.
Sure, that too. Yeah. But I think the sort of like, there's almost become this understanding of, or this idea that you don't want to give, if they expect you to catch the ball, then you should swat the ball away. And it's like, well, but that's not what people want. You don't do it just because, like, as you were saying, Michael, just because it's surprising. You know, it's like, do the thing people want, but then do it in a way that they weren't expecting. So you get kind of the best of both worlds, which is like, you are surprised, but also satisfied.
Right. And that's why writing is hard.
Yeah.
Right.
Give the people what they want.
Yeah.
And
Also juggling, not
them.
easy.
Yeah.
Exactly.
For sure. Why don't we go around and say what we've been watching? Trisha, what have you been watching?
So I recently just watched something that I thought was really fun. It's also a 2020 film.
Where are you finding these?
I know. They're on the internet. This makes sense. This is The Trip to Greece with Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon.
Right.
It's the fourth film in this like series that they've done, which is actually they shoot it as like a mini series kind of, and then they assemble it into a movie.
Right. It's a 6-part series that airs in England, and then they'll make a movie and like put it out for the world, basically.
Right. So it's this really episodic movie that does have like through lines, and Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon are basically playing versions of themselves. Their names are Steve and Rob, and they like talk a lot about their own careers. Why am I explaining this? Go watch them. There have been 4 of them. They're just delightful. They're like a variation on a travel show where there's a lot of like, they just go to a foreign country or whatever.
Go to restaurants.
Eat a lot of amazing food. Yeah, exactly. They've been to Italy, Spain, and Greece now is this last one. And they say this is going to be the last one. But they're mostly it's just them sitting in restaurants doing impressions and talking about their careers. And it's very easy viewing right now in 2020, and lots of like, oh, remember travel, that kind of emotion, which can be delightful in its own way. But also Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon are just wonderful to watch, and that level of self-awareness that they bring to it, of like they're poking fun at each other's careers, and there's usually some kind of like cathartic thing that's also going on in their personal lives, or this version of themselves and their personal lives. So it's a really fun watch, The Trip to Greece.
Awesome. Alex, what have you been watching? Is there some new show you're going to make us all watch?
No, not a new show. Actually, a Netflix original movie, The Old Guard, which premiered recently. Charlize Theron action movie, and it was fun. It was really kind of an interesting surprise because it's based on a graphic novel. It was directed by Gina Prince Blythewood. She's a Black woman, and you can tell it's kind of doing a superhero action movie from a different lens, different perspective. You can just kind of feel it in the filmmaking and the character choices. And there's actually a lot of queer characters in it, so it's a really interesting mix of like, we're doing semi-supernatural superhero based on a graphic novel thing. It's got elements in it that you probably couldn't have in an international theatrical release for cultural reasons, but it can get an international Netflix release. And it was really interesting. The end of the movie, I didn't expect this, but it basically was announcing this is just the beginning of a series of films. Like, it was
really cool.
Very explicitly, there will be a sequel kind of a vibe at the end. It's a good, 2 hours of fun, and it's Charlize Theron kicking ass, which is always great. It was directed by Gina Prince Blythewood. So I recommend it. It's a fun time. And I'm very curious to see if Netflix is going to go for like having their own like film franchises. They haven't really done that.
Yeah.
They have series, but to have it actually like a film franchise would be a new thing for them. So
it was only a matter of time, though.
Yeah.
What is film? What is TV? Does it even matter?
Stay tuned. We'll solve it.
Brian, how about you?
Carl Reiner passed away recently at the ripe old age of 98. And one of the other VHSs I had as a kid was the animated special of The 2,000-Year-Old Man, which was a comedy routine that Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner used to do. And they had like 5 albums, and The 2,000-Year-Old Man was on every single one of them. And it's basically Carl Reiner interviewing Mel Brooks, who is playing a 2,000-year-old man, so has lived through all of history and is like telling stories about how, like, you know, love stemmed from fear because the reason you needed a partner was to just so you could stand back to back and make sure there wasn't a lion coming, you know, things like that.
Yeah.
And but they took one of the routines and they actually animated it into like a 25, 30-minute special where they're actually, you're hearing just their routine, but you're seeing them just talk to each other and they're doing flashbacks and all this stuff. And I had it as a kid and I watched it so many times and that I could quote it. My friend and I still quote it to each other to this day. And I had not watched it in a long time. So after hearing the news, I went on YouTube and found it and was able to watch it again. And it's just really delightful. Check it out. And then also Carl Reiner created the Dick Van Dyke Show. And was actually going to play the main character when it was not going to be called the Dick Van Dyke Show, obviously. Man About the House or something like that was what it was going to be called. And there's a pilot, I think, with him playing Rob. But he ended up playing Alan Brady, who is the television show host that Dick Van Dyke is writing for. And he just has a bunch of great scenes. And you can watch some of them on YouTube, too. I mean, I'd recommend going and actually watching the Dick Van Dyke Show. I was obsessed with it as a kid, and Mary Tyler Moore Show, which Carl Reiner kind of discovered both of those actors basically and sort of gave them their careers. So it just gave me kind of a nostalgia kick of these, you know, the 2,000-year-old man, Dick Van Dyke, Mary Tyler Moore, just some things I loved as a kid and just really wanted to revisit. And yeah.
After I heard the news, I went back and watched Fatal Instinct,
Wow.
which is, I know, which is Carl Reiner's like spoof of
90s,
film noir
yeah.
and erotic thrillers.
Right.
Which is super ridiculous and kind of just fun to watch.
It's pretty great that YouTube exists.
Yeah,
can do that.
Yeah,
like, yeah. There are good things about the times we live in.
Yeah, Michael, what are you watching?
So mine's actually a podcast that I went back and listened to in preparation for this episode, and kind of coming off of Dark and thinking about determinism and why I'm obsessed with it and all these things. There's this episode of Radiolab called Revising the Fault Line. And I realized that that's kind of where the idea of determinism, where I first encountered it and where it first resonated with me. So it's this episode that they did about this man who had epilepsy. And so he had to have several different brain surgeries to try to help that and prevent the seizures. And each time they had to like scoop out this very specific part of his brain, and it successfully stopped him from having seizures for a while anyway, but also dramatically changed his behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And long story short, I won't get into the details, but he ends up in prison for having some pretty disturbing obsessions and stuff. But then basically what they do is they bring in this neurologist, Robert Sapolsky, who weighs in on the court's decision and sort of talks about, you know, how we look at responsibility. And if you look at the history of humans and how we explain behavior, we had crazy explanations for a long time of like, well, if you were, you know, possessed by the devil, or like your parents raised you wrong and that's why you're dyslexic, or basically it goes through all these things that like for a long time we just assumed were all these weird things. And then eventually science caught up and was like, actually, no, that's a brain thing. That's a brain chemistry thing. That's a neurological thing. And so he sort of introduces this idea of like, on a long enough timeline, it's very likely that all behavior can be traced to just neurological, inputs and reactions and stuff. And so it then kind of gets into this idea of, as it's all kind of centered around the justice system, because I think that's the most applicable part of thinking about determinism. But basically, like, how do we judge people? What do we do with people that have clearly done bad things and are dangerous for the world, but maybe also can't help it? And why do we like to punish people? It raises a lot of really interesting things about human nature and like kind of the whole spectrum of human nature. And I've thought about it a lot since first listening to it. So I went back and listened to it. It's really interesting. So I recommend it to people. So yeah, the episode is Revising the Fault Line by Radiolab.
That's awesome. I'm going to listen to that.
What's one of the quotes that opens the season of Dark is something about like, man cannot will what he wills, or something. It was, I should have it in front of me, but basically it was about that. It was like, basically trying to sum up in like a elegant quote the idea that like you might have a will, but you cannot will what that will do. So putting it in that way.
The creators have said that. Like, I have a quote here in front of me by Jante Fries, who says, we've dedicated our past years to deciphering human behavior, trying to figure out why people do very bad things. It always comes down to some kind of programming that you cannot choose because you cannot let go of the stuff that happened to you.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really interesting part of this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it doesn't have to be nihilistic. I think it can also just be like the world is crazy and we live in this beautiful, insane universe where the more you learn about how things work, the more impossible it all seems.
Right.
So awesome. Well, this has been our conversation about Dark. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to the patrons for making this podcast possible. And we will see you in the next episode.
Bye, everybody.
Ultimate fist bump.
The end is the beginning.